Hello, welcome to our August 11th, 2020 Contagion Cultures webinar. We're broadcasting from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee. Queen's University was inaugurated on these lands in 1841 by the British Crown. Thus, our institution of higher learning, as many others, is also an imperial project. We should strive to right ongoing wrongs against Indigenous peoples. I hope that this series, which aims to incorporate and further various ways of thinking about how to best live with all of the planet and its living beings, works in this direction. Contagion Cultures is a Faculty of Arts and Science collaboration between the School of Policy Studies and my home department, Languages, Literatures, and Cultures, and the Faculty of Arts and Science, with the support of Queen's Library. The talks are live streamed Tuesdays at 4 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time or Eastern Standard Time until at least the end of December 2020. The talks will be freely available online and they'll be archived at the library. We particularly hope that people will use these vodcasts in their teaching. Queen's Contagion Cultures Lectures helps make sense of the pandemic through the expertise and insights of arts and science faculty members. This public-facing series leverages the powerful tools of humanistic analysis to grapple with these turbulent times. We hope you pre-register and join us each week. And please get the word out to all interested listeners. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Aditi Sen. Aditi Sen is a historian of religion, specializing on ancient India. Major part of her early work focused on evil spirits and folk medicine. And she has also worked on mythology and folklore in Bollywood horror films. Her co-edited book with Ellen Bloomberg and Brian Collins on Bollywood horror comes out this year from Bloomsbury Press. Congratulations. Her current work is on forensics in colonial India. And her talk today is entitled Colonial India and Contagion. And it'll be in two parts, and please write questions for the Q&A afterward in the chat, which you'll find by hovering over the bottom center of your screen. We'll have about 20 minutes for the Q&A, and we aim to finish before the top of the hour. Aditi.
Thanks, Jen. And my lecture will be divided in two parts. The first part, very simple, is chronologically divided. The first part would be on pre-colonial times. The next part is after colonization. So give me a second as I start my PowerPoint where we have, okay. And so the first part, I will start with a little story. And this story will introduce us effectively to the themes in the first part of my talk. So this story, titled The Lime Tree, takes place in colonial Bengal. You're talking of a time, say the late 19th century, sometimes around 1880s, 90s. Those days in cities like Calcutta, Bombay, you had a system called the mess. In the mess, you had people who would work in cities. They had their jobs in the cities, so they lived in the mess. And their families were way back in rural Bengal or rural India. And they spent the week because, the trains, the services were not so good. They couldn't commute all the time. So they lived in these temporary lodgings called messes. And they would go home regularly in the weekends. Now, often when there was a lot of work, they couldn't go home. And it would be, they couldn't go home for a month or 2 months. And well, that happened quite often, that they were busy, they would live in the mess. And our protagonist, the story, is about a man called Gopal Das, who works in Calcutta, lives in a mess, and his family is in Bengal, in rural Bengal. Now, it's been a month. He had been busy at work. It's been a month, and after a month, he is going home. He arrives at his rural hometown, and his village is about a few miles walk away from the station. As he arrives in the station, he notices that it's uncannily, silent. There is absolutely nobody there. It's eerie. The silence is eerie. Usually, there were people in the station. There would be 3 or 4 people. There was usually a shanty selling tea. There's absolutely nothing. And then the silence sort of bothers him. It's already dusk when he's reached, the sky is dark, but he decides that that's fine, I will walk and go home. As he begins his walk, and the village also, as he's walking, he notices that the village is unusually quiet. There's nobody, absolutely quiet. And at a distance, he can see there's a dim light in his house. But every house is very, very dark. But this is a time electricity had not reached India, but not reached Bengal. But, there would still be lamp, there would still be sort of some sort of life. He sees nothing. Anyway, he reaches home, knocks on his door, and his mother opens the door. What he finds surprising is his mother's reluctance to talk to him. She's only replying in monosyllables. And she says that, yes, the whole family has gone to sleep, but she was waiting for him because she knew he was coming and she had to serve him dinner. Well, he washes up and sits to have dinner. The dinner is very simple. It's dal and rice. Dal is lentil soup. And as he is eating his dinner, he realizes that his dinner is very, very bland. The dal is really bland. So he asks his mother if he could flavor the dal with some lemon. I need a little flavor to my dal. And she says, of course, the lime tree is right there. I will get you some lime. And she stretches her hand out. And she stretches and stretches and stretches and crosses the window and crosses the threshold and reaches right at the lime tree, plucks the lime and gives it to him. The story ends here. But there is a postscript to the story. What had happened is that cholera had struck the village when he was away, and every single person in the village was dead. Although it's a very popular ghost story, it's a popular folk story. It exists in many combinations. It's told all over India. It's a story often retold. What we have to see here is this story is based in some sort of reality. People did often go back home to find that everybody they knew, the whole village was dead. Let's look at some of the statistics here. Bengali folklore especially preserves a lot of these ghost stories and all that. And the statistics show, for example, in 1906, 30% of rural Bengal dies of cholera. So this might be a ghost story, but this is one way of preserving memories of people who died in epidemics. That's because there is otherwise no glory, no record, nothing. It's not a story that you remember, well, they died of epidemic. This is how you preserve memory. That's the first way memory is preserved. And therefore, in the first half, what we are looking at is how the natives or the Indian world understood diseases and public health and cure before colonization. Okay? And really, epidemic was forever there because things really changed once in 1896 when plague comes. But before that, one way that people remembered epidemic and public health was through these ghost stories. And these stories float all over India. What were some of the diseases that people were facing, problems? The most important being cholera, and it's a very dramatic disease. So most ghost stories are connected to cholera anyway. Smallpox, polio, malaria, these, and even again, you have 1921 census where you have about 5 million dying of malaria. So those are huge numbers. Now, let me talk about the traditional way of traditional Indian understanding of diseases. And that first comes from the Atharvaveda. And the text is tentatively dated between 1400 to 1200 BC. The word tentative here is very, very important because the dating is somewhat problematic in the Indian tradition. Now, a large chunk of the text is devoted to folk medicine and diseases. Diseases are seen as evil spirits who attack you, and the cure lies in herbs and roots, but also you have to placate the roots, the herbs and roots before administering them to the disease. In fact, the Atharva Veda does a very good job of, describing the spirits, these evil spirits who attack you. For example, there's a spirit called Grahi. She is the spirit of joint pain. And Grahi has forceps, and with those forceps, she's going to grab your joints. So all kinds of graphic description of spirits. But the system is fairly simple. If we were to think, it is really animism at play. You have a disease, an evil spirit that attacks you, and then the cure lies in herbs, and the spirit of the herbs will also help fight it. So it's a kind of a spiritual realm where the spirits are fighting each other to help you get cured of the disease. So that's the basic animist system. It's very animism kind of a thing that's existing in the Atharva Veda. We have this framework, but this gets way more sophisticated as medicine emerges, and you have the Ayurveda, which is later. And Ayurveda is fairly sophisticated understanding of human body, not different from the humoral medicine theory that was in the West. All over, the idea of diseases is very, very closely linked to imbalance in the body. And in Ayurveda, you have 5 different elements: air, water, sky, fire, and ether. So Ayurveda, of course, as I say, it's sophisticated medical text, and they believe the cure really is in the diet. That's the main thing that you will find in humoral medicine too, in ancient Chinese medicine too. The diet is the cure. The approach is always holistic. That's something that has happened to your body, medicine, all that. Yes, herbs and all that can help you get better in some ways, but it really is a much more comprehensive way of curing by changing your lifestyle, altering your diet. So those are the ways people look at diseases. Now, what happens is you have epidemics that kind of complicates that, and that happens again everywhere. That epidemics will complicate that view of diseases, that understanding of diseases. And things like smallpox, cholera, they really didn't know what happened because, cholera, for example, people did not stop drinking contaminated water and food. And cholera acts very fast. They would continue to do that. And cholera was, you could be fit in the morning and completely cadaverized by the night. It's very quick. The death is in 2 or 3 days. And that's why we go back to our village, where the story, everyone is dead in the village, is a possibility. You see reports where they talk about actual villages like that, where cholera it's very dramatic. It was going to kill very, very quickly too. So in these cases, this animism, religious framework becomes a little difficult to explain. However, we have the religious framework is quite interesting in how it operates in India and somewhat different from rest of the world. Now, the idea that religion is, that diseases are punishment from gods or pestilence is God's way of, telling us we have sinned is common everywhere. That is something that's on the background. That theory is very, very, very common. However, in India, that theory, of course, exists. There is a bit of a difference in India. What happens in India is sometimes, and I'll give you this with an example, like the goddess that you're looking at called Shitala. I'll give you an example with that and show you how medical treatment and mythology and understanding diseases can go hand in hand. So Shitala is a folk goddess who was specifically designed to fight smallpox. Smallpox has always, it's existed from ancient times all over the old world. It's been there from ancient times. The Atharva Veda calls it the fever of Masurika. Masurika means red lentils. So they have been aware of this disease for a very long time. Shitala specifically was created for smallpox inoculation. There is a mythology attached to her. The demon called Jwarasur. Jwara means fever, and Asur means demon. So he's a fever demon. And this evil fever demon would affect children with fever, incurable fever, and give rise to pustules. Now, Shitala was the healing one or the cooling one. That's the meaning of her name. She fought this demon and she cured the children. There are many variations of the story. The mythology has many variants. There are also many origin stories of Shitala. But what happens really is her temple, in her worship, it basically her worship centers were also places where inoculation, rudimentary, basic, crude methods of inoculation happened. Now, smallpox is very interesting because the old world had understood just through observation that if you got it once, you did not get it again. Inoculation exists in ancient China, in the whole of Middle East, and India is no exception. Except in India, they think of it as something like the blessing of Shitala. And so her temple became a place where people came to get inoculated. Very, very crude method again. It's very briefly if I go. And this crude method, by the way, happens in different places too. So you would select someone who had a mild case of smallpox, really mild case. You would dip a thread or some kind of a swab into the pustule and introduce it to the person who was going to be inoculated into their bloodstream through a cut. And they got the mild case and they lived. This was seen as Shitala's blessing. So the religious element, that's where it was quite powerful, that it was seen as a blessing. And Shitala would bless you, you would not get it again. So it was a very interesting way of working through, this kind of inoculation and how you have medical treatment, mythology, all going hand in hand. And again, even Edward Jenner, who's the father of vaccines and immunization, he also actually observed through observation. He was a country doctor, and he observes and notices that people did not, milkmaids did not get smallpox because of cowpox. But as I said, Shitala, so you can see how there is this space where you can have medical treatment and religion and all that operating together. Now, when the British came, what kind of world did they see? What kind of India did they see? The existing medical system really was an amalgamation of various Ayurvedic practices and Unani medicine being of the Islamic origin. And it was the practitioners of Ayurvedic medicine were known as Veds, and Unani medicine was practiced by Hakims. Now, the medical system of the Hindus and Muslims was similar in many ways, and there was a lot of agreement between the two. They had no fundamental difference and operated harmoniously. Unani medicine also depends on herbal treatments, and again, they were all holistic approach and holistic systems. So you did not really have anything that was in disagreement. They were not, but very, very different from each other. So the world that the British come and see is this kind of a herbal, holistic, and it's not very different from their idea of humoral medicine and all that. That's the world they see. But things really, really start to change when you have 1896 plague. But before I take you to the second part of my talk, what I want to talk about is a murder mystery. I started with a ghost story, but I want to go to a murder mystery. And this murder mystery is based on a true story. I'll go over it very quickly because, again, this story will introduce us to the theme that I look in the next section. Now, in 1933, the story takes place. The picture you see here in 1933 in Howrah Station in Calcutta. Now, Howrah Station is the main station, train station for people in Calcutta. So what happened here? The Prince of Pakur. Pakur is a small princely state in eastern India. The Prince of Pakur was injected with plague bacterium by a hired assassin, and he died of bubonic plague in 1933. Now, there were no plague cases going on at all, and investigations revealed that his stepbrother, who was much older than him, had planned this with his friend who was connected to Haskin Biomedical Research Center in Bombay, from where he obtained the plague culture. Solving this case, and you can imagine, it took a lot of work. The case actually stays in public memory for a long time, took years and years to get solved. But this case is very unique because the body gets cremated. The prince is Hindu, the body is cremated. But the first doctor who was called on the scene when he got sick took a sample of his blood and sent it to the tropical medicine research lab. And based on that medical report, the entire conviction, the entire investigation, and people get convicted. The guilty party involved, of course, the stepbrother, the family doctor, the biomedical researcher, and the assassin. And they all confessed to to murdering this young boy. The case, although very, very unique, and of course a long case that I've shortened, a very unique case, it definitely what was really the focus of the case, besides being interesting, was the plague. Because the British, that's what changed completely the relationship between the British and the Indians, was the 1896 plague. Okay. Because it's a visible clash. We are looking at a visible problem, and the visible clash, in fact, it led to the assassination of plague officer in Pune. In case of plague, I'm going to focus on the Bombay presidency because that's where all the problems happened. That's where all the resistance happened, as well as Pune, of course, which is near Bombay, where the assassination happens. Now, the main problem when plague came to India from Hong Kong, the main problem, of course, was how intrusive the government had become. The intrusiveness of the government into private lives of the people is what bothered. And what were these measures? What did they do so much that it led to an assassination and all kinds of resistance and violence? What happened? The first thing that happened, and that didn't meet any resistance, by the way, the first thing that happened was they did bonfire, cleaned the streets, and those were fine. The next step was to enter the houses and start not just, while cleaning it up, but taking away the roofs, taking away, water supplies were inspected repeatedly. Then, of course, they burned down some houses that they marked UHH, or unfit for human habitation. And as one newspaper in India talks about, says there was everywhere, they just drenched our house with phenyl, carbolic acid, lime, alum. We were half-skinned beyond disbelief. And that's when people started getting upset. Then the officers would come into their house and take very, very strict measures, and they lost control of their houses and lives. But again, this really was not the main problem of, that still didn't create that much of resistance, except when people were forcefully hospitalized. That's when the real protest started happening, when people were forcefully hospitalized and treated in the Western British way. Let us look at what was in the treatment for a second. Let's focus on that. What was the treatment that bothered the Indians so much? In 1899, and I read this out from, this British Library's report on this, the plague report. They're saying the standard food for the patients were 8 ounces of rum, sago congee, and Liebig's meat extract. If I look at Liebig's meat extract, you see it has beef in it. Let's look at the population, Hindus and Muslims. Muslims don't drink, strictly prohibition of alcohol. A lot of Hindus don't drink. The Hindus have serious beef taboo. In fact, some of them would rather die than eat beef. So there is huge resistance. And you find the British reports continuously saying how illiterate Indians are resisting our treatment. There is a period of intense hostility. Again, there's another level of problem. The Hindus are complaining that there's a caste hierarchy and how upper caste Hindus have been put with lower caste Hindus. So the problems are on many levels and the resistance is massive. Also, we notice that here the Hindus and Muslims are resisting against the British together. So it becomes many layers of protest, and also it becomes inside there's also other religious issues that's at play. Now, we have what are the local treatments. Therefore, this was the British forced hospitalization, this kind of food. All this problem is the British response. What were the Indians doing? Because that will give us an idea about how the two medical systems were operating. What were they doing? The Indians were looking at, so we have few cases, as I read out some cases to you. There is a healer in Bombay who claimed she was possessed by goddess Kali. And this is a bit graphic, so I apologize in advance. She says that she stepped on her victims and bit their buboes to cure it. Now, she was, of course, arrested for endangering public health. But there were other cures too. The Surat Akhbar, which is a newspaper based in Surat, recommended cow urine, which they said it's in the Vedas that purifies, and cow urine should be able to cure us from the plague. Now, what you're looking at in this picture is a cow urine from Amazon, India, that I picked up the photographs. It was recommended again in coronavirus time. That was the time for, they thought this could both prevent and cure corona. So this is coming back again. It comes back and forth. Cow urine often comes up during epidemics. And as I said in Amazon, and I was surprised to find there are many brands of cow urine. So it's still, very much there. And of course, the lunar cycle, many explanations, which are not that, the lunar cycle and all that are not very different from the 17th century British explanations, oddly. So all that was happening with the local thing. But the British also were very, very angry because the Indians were resisting their treatment. And the force continues right up to 1900. So Rand's assassination does not really stop it. And I will talk a little bit about Rand's assassination and the Pune situation, why it led to an assassination. But the British also, there were many, many riots that were happening. They brought the police in, there were repeated riots. One particular riot was in a place called Madanpura in Bombay, where a Parsi student, Eurasian doctor, and a British plague officer, all three get attacked because they were checking this. They wanted to check a patient who was a 12-year-old plague patient. And the riots get quite intense, and you have police firing with 5 dead. So repeated cases of riots, resistance, continuously happening with the plague measures. But Pune was much, much worse. Because Pune, the officer who got assassinated, there was very stringent rules, much worse than Bombay. There were forced body searches of both men and women, and of course the search involved stripping. Troops were deployed, forced segregation of healthy members from the sick, and people were forcibly taken to hospitals. Plus, the troops that came, they were all European soldiers, and that intimidated the natives a lot. And things got so bad in Pune that you have plenty of propaganda literature that said it's better to commit mass suicide than to go through this horrible British interference in our lives. Now, 1897, that seems to be a very important year also. Haskell had developed a plague serum. Now, this prophylactic had very, very mixed review. And we don't know if that worked or not, because we know plague prophylactics is still kind of problematic. But by 1920, plague had completely vanished from India. And Haskell Institute actually played a major role in plague research. So going back to the murder case that I started with, we look at the beginning. First of all, plague has that sense of fear and in the British authority mind. It immediately creates panic. The second thing was when they realized that it's an isolated case, and they had to investigate Haskell because they knew that this kind of plague culture could only come from a place like Haskin. So that's why all these frontiers get very important during this time when you have the plague, the memory of the plague playing a big role. Now, in 1912, the Bombay Medical Act, or the Registration of Medical Practitioners Act, completely kept Ayurveda and Hakimi medicine out. Indian doctors trained in Western medicine supported it, and the Indian system was pushed out. Now, there's a widespread protest for it. And the Pune Ayurvedic dispensary was closed, and there was plenty of protest ongoing. So you can see how at different levels the British were now forcing the Western system on the Indians. And even though the Registration Act left them out, we have to remember that together, the Western and the Eastern traditional system really never went away. It's still very much alive, very much there. They had started existing together. And a good way to see that, to understand that, would be to look at the Spanish flu. Because this is happening in 1918 when it has come, and how the state authorities react and how tradition react. This is an interesting space to look at that. So it's a very unique thing because the trajectory of Spanish flu is very, very different from others. And David Arnold's recent article is on Spanish flu really talks about this unique flu that happened in India. He maintains that about 12 to 18 million people died in the flu and pulmonary complications related to the flu. Yet, India's public health priorities had remained smallpox, cholera, plague, malaria, tuberculosis. So the flu does not feature at all in their priority. However, just like the rest of the world, we have records of the public health system being completely overwhelmed by the flu. And I want to quote from him how India was facing this and what are the ways we may look at the Spanish flu of 1918? What are the sources that we might look at what happened? First of all, the burial grounds are swamped with corpses, so much so that bodies are rotting and they don't know what to do. India's medical modernity was fragile, particularly when confronted with an epidemic crisis of such monumental proportions. And I'm quoting Arnold here. His workers in more self-evidently modern sectors of the Indian economy were among the worst hit. Docks, railways, trams, telegraph, and postal services almost came to a standstill. Productivity in the textile factories slumped as half the workforce lay sick and dying or had fled. In the Kolar goldfields in Mysore, there were 13,600 cases of influenza, which is half their workforce, and 960 had died. The High Court in Calcutta was unable to function as judges, lawyers, jurors all fell sick. The High Court in Calcutta, the Forestry Service, among the colonial India's proudest and largest enterprise, was ground to a virtual halt as officers, laborers all fell sick. Actually, he sums up very correctly and says one of the reasons the flu is missing in that the presence of the flu is missing is because almost everyone was affected by it. They were too sick or overworked to document it. And that's why you have all these reports in 1917 when so many health officers are saying, finally, it looks like we have a control over the contagion, and they don't know what hit them in 1918. The Punjab health officer, he's writing how, there's corpses everywhere. The trains are working, but trains arrive when people have died on the way. It's full of corpses. The roads are littered with corpses. There is reports from all over when there seems to be a complete overwhelming with this kind of bodies. Here, the state reaction was exact opposite of the plague. They refused to intervene at all in any way. In fact, the middle class, you have a lot of writing, but they're saying that we are begging the government to do something, but they're not listening to us at all. This is just the opposite of what they were doing in plague. They have completely washed their hands off this disease. In this case, what happened was agencies like the Ramakrishna Mission, Arya Samaj, and these are all religious organizations, the Seva Samiti and the Bombay Social Service League, they stepped in. They became active, and the Ayurveda practitioners, Unani medicine, and homeopathy practitioners were the ones stepping and helping out. And the middle class actually actively helps out by donating money, organizing food, shelter, helping in treatment. So you have the state machinery moving away, and you have local systems, local methods coming and helping out in this case. Also, we have to remember that this pandemic was followed by a lot of famines, and the effect was really compounded. And that's why Arnold is guessing it's 12 to 18 million, because poor nutritional areas with poor nutrition and all that were way more affected than, cities and other places, with the death rate was fairly high in those parts. So in conclusion, I want to say, while Western medicine still certainly looms large in India, traditional practices go hand in hand. And I will talk about COVID a little bit here. In case of COVID, a few things happened. We saw the cow urine thing, that's straight from the plague. But we also saw the creation of Coronasur, which is, again, if you remember, Jwarasur. Corona is the Corona, and Asur is the demon. So Corona demon, who was ritually burned during Holi in March. So visualization has still stayed alive we may still find that quite amusing, many did, but the idea of visualizing is very much built into the Indian, especially the Hindu thinking of diseases. They like to personify, think of diseases that way, and that exists. And while let's also think a little bit of the Indian market, as I have these two pictures, that yes, the Western medicine definitely looms large, but there is space for alternative medicine as well. And some of the more very dominating health products in the market are of Ayurvedic and Unani tradition. And these two, any Indian would recognize. Dabur's Chyawanprash is actually a health supplement food, which contains many herbal things, but the recipe is credited to ancient sage Chavan. It seems he saved that recipe, and that's there. And the other side, you have Roo Afza by Hamdard, which is a summer drink and very delicious, if I may add. It has many Unani qualities, mainly rose flavored, but it has many other medicinal properties. So if you think of to go back to modern India market and to sort of think about that, it is an amalgamation of Western medicine, that is hospital medicine, all that is very much there, and you have traditional practices, which I still believe a lot of Indians first go to before going and buying a medicine. Many would try to think of a natural cure, especially for something like a fever or stomach problems. People still bank on folk medicine and local medicine. But one thing, as we go through a pandemic, it's important to remember that we may have moved. It's 2020. We may have made many progress. We know about virus. We know so much. It's never that traditions go away. They're really lurking right there in the corner, and they just show up. And India has seen that they have, especially with the right-wing government right now in power, India actually sees way more negative side of the alternative practices than before. But again, to remind that things don't go away at all. You have tradition and modernity existing, and tradition really never goes away. I'll stop here and take questions. Just to stop screen sharing. And
thank you very much for that fascinating look at a historical panorama of these pandemics in the Indian context, and then bringing it up to the current moment with COVID, really useful layering their background. I wonder if I could
sure.
take the crack at a first question. Thinking about the pharmaceutical industry and medical industry in India is so strong and powerful, and you talked a lot about that maybe the average person might tend to go to a traditional or herbal solution rather than maybe their first choice being taking a more like Western medicine. And so I wondered whether the health industry there has done some work in mainstreaming more traditional medicines, also perhaps with a kind of research with like double-blind studies and so forth that are the gold standard in Western medicine.
Yeah, there is the Ministry of Ayush, which is Ayurveda, Yoga, Unani, I forget, homeopathy, all of that. So there is the Ministry of Ayush that says it's for research on alternative therapies in medicine. So you have, there is a ministry there, but then Ayush has gotten into a lot of controversy too, because they kept saying things like, if you have turmeric regularly, it's going to be okay. So there's kind of a problem, but there is a ministry that helps in the research and all that. So with this alternative medicine is getting kind of more mainstream now. With you have Patanjali brand, which is owned by a guru, and that's fairly popular. Patanjali came up with something called Colonial, which was kind of Ayurvedic treatment of corona. But that's
That then it has been marketed widely, or precisely was not marketed widely?
But it got into controversy. They had to stop. There was all kinds of problems that happened with it. But that happened. Yes, I have that too.
Mm-hmm. And I wondered if you could speak about the different layerings in the Indian society in terms of caste and class. It might be too large to think about all of the different epidemics that you were talking about, but how does that play into who is getting sick, able to protect themselves, gets involved with helping, doesn't get involved in helping?
The first part of your question was lost, so I kind of didn't. So sorry, Jen, could you just repeat, and I'll take Margaret's question as well. So yeah.
Yeah, so we're getting a bevy of questions here in the chat, and the question about the question from me was to sort of divide the population according to structures of power and privilege, and who tended to be hit more or less, and who could maybe escape to outside of the city, as we see so many times in today's coronavirus as well.
Yeah, well, very often though, I think diseases, especially while in rural Bengal, and I told the ghost story where you have so many people dying, it's because the nutrition levels are poor. So malaria and all that, and nutrition and life loss is very closely connected. Famines, nutrition, poor nutrition. In Spanish flu, Arnold thinks way more women died than men, because women's nutritional levels were low, and they died much more than men. So there are, but sometimes again in plague, you had all these people who could go to villages ran away from Bombay. So, and they were in the villages. Plague really didn't affect villages much less than it affected the cities. All the British force was happening in cities. That, in Calcutta, they're again going into homes and doing it. It's most in Bombay though. It's also in Karachi, that spreads to Karachi, but they do that much less than they are doing in Bombay. And people who tend to die more, you have, for cholera, malaria, you have rural deaths are much more than urban deaths, because nutrition, I think very often nutritional availability and health, overall health is very important here. But the overall health was poor in these places, particularly of women. So you have women dying in larger numbers. With the flu, you definitely a lot of records. In fact, well, cholera has sort of tends to kill equally when they kill whole villages. You have many, many, many reports where you have people coming back and seeing the whole village is dead. That ghost story has a lot of reality. It's based on reality. I mean, there was no ghost probably, but the reality was there. That's how I remember it. So I'll just take Margaret's question here. Right, Margaret's asking if Spanish flu was so different. Yeah, that's the thing, Margaret. So she's saying, why was the British response to Spanish flu in India so different from their earlier response to 1896 plague? Does it have to do with the status of the Spanish flu as a world pandemic? That's, one thing is because the whole idea that it's just a flu was problematic. That happens in America also, right? Unless, Crosby, that's one of the things Crosby writes in his book. And he says most people are saying it's still just a flu. So the British response would be that, this is just a flu. So let's not also World War. They're exhausted. The resources are not that much. They're exhausted. And they see if the middle class, is helping out, and they have to help their soldiers too. So the British are again focusing on their soldiers. They're thinking of their soldiers who are, exhausted, and it's called the war fever. So they are the ones who get it. So they are focusing. They would rather help their soldiers than to help the population. And the number is very, very large. Everybody's sick, so they decide to completely neglect it. But again, I think deep inside it, the idea still is it's just a flu. So, and that happens globally. If you know that, that's when the Americans don't react to it. They keep thinking it's just a flu, it's just a flu, it's just a flu, and they have large numbers dying. The same thing. In fact, for the longest time, people didn't even mention the Spanish flu. It's only really about 20 years or so that people have been talking way more about the Spanish flu than they have been before. And now, of course, it's the flu before we had this. So I hope that's sort of, yeah. I have another question from Ghulam. So yeah, I know. Hi, Ghulam. I know you do bowel folklore and among bowel use of garlic among bowel communities for treatment come from the Ayurveda. My question, do you think Western medicine is responsible for the reduction of Ayurveda and Unani in South Asia? The holistic lifestyle Ayurveda and Unani offer is not available in Western medicine. And he loved Chyawanprash. Okay, that's good to know. So they did. They definitely wanted to cancel out Ayurveda and Unani medicine. They definitely wanted to do that because they saw, especially during plague, they saw these practitioners as problem and as threats. And this clash is actually still very much there in modern India. Every time you have come up with this kind of alternative solution, people are very suspicious of it. And that debate goes on. I don't want to take a position here because I think, we have this whole, the holistic approach is better or not. In some cases, we absolutely need hospital medicine, Western medicine. But yes, to answer your question, yes, they did. Once you, have the Registration Act in 12 and tell that now you are not really legal that way. Ayurvedic practice has somehow become less than, the traditional practice. So naturally, there was it is a socio-political move to do that, but also there was support from India. So there was also support from doctors who were trained in Western medicine. So the shift had come. The shift was very much there. But yeah, there was definitely, you have, but as I said, even after all this, they still cannot change the fact that Chyawanprash sells well and all this kind of sells well. All that is there. And I have a question from Nabila, who is asking, are there fundamental differences? Not really. I mean, yes, in the sense that they come from different schools. But if you think of most schools in the ancient world, they're all thinking of humoral theory and imbalance in the body. From Chinese to Unani to Galenic humoral medicine, they're all thinking that diseases are caused by imbalance in the body. The cure lies in holistic approach, food, herbal medicine. Unani is very, very herbal based. That's why I say they didn't have difference. The Hakim and Vaid didn't really have a lot of difference of opinion. They might have used a different herb or something, but fundamentally their outlook was very, very similar. They would have difference of opinion with the British, not with each other so much, because the outlook is always cure has to be slow. You have to wait for a cure, and cure really has to be something more permanent. You can't keep getting fevers again and again. You have to sort of cure yourself. You have to change your diet. You have to exercise. You have to do different things so that the cough you get every month gets less and less. So that kind of habit forming, that to integrate that into your habit, which we do. I mean, we think of that all the time today when we say that, yeah, you have to be, you have to make this built into your habit, and that's how you never get indigestion or acidity. And they're helpful with problems like that, right? Diabetes, acidity, or chronic acidity, or regular cough and cold. They work. They have you change your diet, you get some of these are very, very helpful. So yeah, depends on, but in epidemic, these become a problem.
I have a comment that it seems such a salient point that you make about the more holistic approach of the Unani and Ayurvedic traditions, and it makes me think about the way that we are talking about confronting the virus and other viruses, because certainly there's there are many ways in which we treat the planet and our lifestyles in general that are furthering that are furthering this virus and the development of viruses in general. And so it's a really great way to think about the micro and the macro, when your specific example here of Indian medicine, but very much connected to the ways that I think also this series is thinking about how to approach the issue of the pandemic, and how to deal with this, and how to deal forward in the future, so that in the future we won't have such a catastrophic situation as we have now. I'd really like to thank you very much, Aditi. Do you have any final comments that you'd like to make?
No, that's thank you for doing this, and yeah, I hope the recording went well, and thank you so much, Jen.
We were thrilled to have you. That was really wonderful, and thank you everybody as well for coming. And I hope that you can tune in to our next upcoming talks. So we have a great lineup. So thanks very much, and stay safe.